Support for this podcast comes from MathWorks, a company accelerating the pace of engineering and science. Stick around until the end of this episode for a special segment about how one company is using MathWorks software to revolutionize outer space navigation.
WBUR Podcasts, Boston.
I'm Daryl C. Murphy, and you're listening to The Common. WBUR State House reporter Walter Wuthman, welcome back.
Hey, thank you, Daryl.
To The Common, the new iteration.
I'm happy to be here.
Oh, man, we're happy to have you. But, unfortunately, Walt, we have to talk about a very unproductive legislative session. A 2-year formal session that ended with an all-nighter.
Massachusetts lawmakers blew past their midnight deadline to end their annual session last night and are still trying to work out last-minute deals on beacon.
Where lawmakers were discussing and going over a dozen or so pretty significant bills, but they only passed 3.
Among the plans that fell apart at the end of the session is a massive economic development bill that included significant...
Talk to us about what happened here.
So they went into last Wednesday night, July 31st, the end of the 2-year session, with about a dozen...
And that's the formal session. The formal session is 2 years long.
It's 2 years long, and it is cut into half. There are 2 annual sessions, and they have these periods of formal lawmaking, where they come into the building in their suits, they take roll call votes, and they do the business of the Commonwealth. They went into the last night of that with about a dozen of these major bills piled up, which is not unusual that they leave a ton of legislation to the end of session.
Because they're known to be pretty slow.
They are known to be slow. There are also strategic reasons to leave this much undone till the end, to build pressure in negotiations and to make sure that your side is getting as much of they want at the end of the session as possible. It was a little unusual just how much legislation had piled up. And then, as you said, it was unusual that, once it was all said and done and we'd stayed up through the night and we'd watch the sun set and then rise over the State House on Thursday morning, they were only able to compromise on and pass 3 of these bills.
So, before we get into the bills that did not pass, let's talk about what actually did pass. What's going to the governor's desk? The
biggest thing, and it was a major priority for Governor Healey, is the Affordable Homes Act, which is a big housing bond bill. She says it's going to spur affordable housing development in the state. It authorizes up to $5.2 billion in bond authorizations, which Healey says is the largest infusion of money into the state's housing crisis in Massachusetts history. It has $2 billion for public housing. It has some really innovative new policies, like allowing people to build accessory dwelling units on their properties. These are also known as like granny flats or guest cottages. Right now, they are not legal by right across the state. This bill makes it possible to build them anywhere, no matter where you live.
Okay, now tell me about the other 2 bills that passed.
One was a veteran services bill, and it would expand access to mental health care for veterans and make it a lot more affordable. The other was a parental equality bill. This was a huge priority for LGBTQ activists, but, couples who identify as heterosexual as well. But it clarifies laws around surrogacy and IVF, that the parents of those children are, in fact, their parents.
Okay, so it sounds like we've had 3 steps forward for the people of Massachusetts. Now let's talk about the 10 bills that did not pass.
Yes, there's some big deal stuff in here. The largest piece of legislation that was left undone is another big bond bill called the Economic Development Bond Bill. It would have put a ton of money into biotech in the life sciences. It's got a lot of money for local communities in it, infrastructure projects, climate tech. In the Senate version, specifically, there was a lot of outside policies. It would have raised the age that young people could be charged as juveniles in court rather than going to adult criminal court. It would have changed the zoning on this piece of riverfront land in Everett to allow for the construction of a Major League Soccer stadium, which the Kraft family and the New England Revolution really wants done. None of it got done. There was a climate and energy bill that would have really sped up the permitting time for new clean energy projects, something that advocates say is extremely important in getting the state carbon neutral by 2050. There was a maternal health bill, a hospital reform bill that was written after the, crisis with the for-profit Steward hospital chain. All of this stuff was left on the cutting room floor. The door's not totally closed on any of these, but the end of formal sessions came and went, and none of these were passed.
How do you only come away with 3 passed bills after a 2-year session? As a group of lawmakers for the state of Massachusetts, how does this happen?
And it's a good question because to an outside resident, you know that Massachusetts has supermajorities in the House and the Senate and a Democratic governor. On paper, it seems that all of these Democratic priorities, like a climate change bill, like money for biotech, should just breeze through.
Rubber stamping, practically.
But that's not the case. There is, some would argue, a healthy level. Some would argue maybe a toxic level of competition between the Massachusetts House and the Massachusetts Senate, and specifically the leadership of those two bodies. So earlier in the week, the Senate passed a pretty major substance abuse bill on one of the final days of session. And a group of reporters found House Speaker Ron Mariano out in the hallways and basically asked, have you seen this? What do you think? Are you going to pass it? And here's what he said.
It's a very difficult expectation for us to hear it, especially when it has proposals, major proposals that we haven't even had the opportunity to debate or vote on. It sort of tells me you're not really serious about passing the bill.
So I had a little bit of a hard time hearing him there. But what was he saying?
So he answered with it shows that they're not really serious about passing the bill, that they did it so close to the end of session. The House then passed a new bill close to the end of session. It would have to do with the shifting of property taxes in the city of Boston. It's a huge priority for Mayor Michelle Wu. A group of reporters chased down Senate President Karen Spilka, asked her, does this fair a chance in the Senate? And she pulled out this crumpled piece of paper with a quote printed on it, and she started to read it. And it was the exact words that Mariano had just spoken in a different hallway, ending with this.
It sort of tells you that they're not really serious about passing the bill to begin with.
Are you borrowing some language from your House counterpart there?
Take it for what you want.
Who did that?
That's Katie Lannon, GBH reporter. This is sort of open warfare. This is the stuff we know often happens behind closed doors, but all of that tension was boiling out into the public eye.
It just seems like the residents of Massachusetts lose out while these chambers go back and forth like this.
I mean, it's debatable. The way that legislators defend this system is they say, by building tension, by building competition, you are getting the best product. The best minds in the House and the best minds in the Senate are going at it, and we are getting these really carefully crafted compromise products. But what happened this year is that those grand bargains did not happen. It was stalemates across the board. Stalemates on the climate bill, stalemates on the hospital reform bill, stalemates on the economic development bill. And so when we all left the State House Thursday morning with all of this business left undone, there were a lot of angry people, not just the advocates who fight for this stuff, but legislators and their staff. And apparently the governor, because she, who does not like to criticize the legislature, immediately came out with a stern statement telling legislators you need to come back into the building as soon as possible and pass this economic development bond bill, which has so much money for so many things across the state.
But tell the truth, Walt. You were pissed off too, weren't you? You stayed up all night. Nothing got done. Or 3 bills got done, right?
I'm a neutral observer of the process, but as I weigh their arguments against reality, I think that they have a lot to answer for.
Mm-hmm. Did you talk to any of the constituents who were there, or any of the advocates who were there, to get their reactions?
I left the State House at around 11 o'clock the next morning, and I switched off with Andrea Perdomo Hernandez, our excellent transportation reporter.
Shout out.
She stumbled across a climate protest, walking through the halls of the State House. People really upset, people openly in tears, just in disbelief that after 2 years of advocating and lobbying and calling their state senators and reps and, writing letters, that nothing had happened. Andrea caught up with Jess Nahigian. She's the political director for the Sierra Club here in Massachusetts. Here's a bit of what she said.
When I told my members this morning that nothing had happened, people were absolutely outraged because it has been a year and a half, and it may be another 2 years before we have a chance to pass climate legislation again. It is not showing the people that you're taking the climate crisis seriously at all.
And she placed the blame squarely at the feet of leadership.
Quite frankly, it is hard because it seems like there are only a couple people in this building who are making decisions and everyone else has just given up their own power.
And, the significance of this particular bill failing is that, we're on a deadline.
We're on a deadline. It is written into law that Massachusetts will be carbon neutral by 2050. And all of these advocates say that this really, really sets the timeline back.
So we talked a little bit about Healey's reaction earlier. Is there anything she can do to get them to pass more of these bills?
It seems that she has. Governors tend to be quite deferential to the legislature. They need the legislature to pass legislation, get it to their desks so they can sign it into law. So much of her agenda lies in the hands of the 200 members of the Massachusetts legislature. But, she did come out with that, I would say, sternly worded statement Friday saying you need to come back and pass this economic development bond bill. And very quickly, Senate President Karen Spilka said they're prepared to do just that, followed by House Speaker Ron Mariano, who said they'd be prepared to as well once they have an agreement on that bill. And that's the whole problem, that they don't have agreement. And that's why it didn't pass earlier this week. But it does seem that they are willing to break their own rules to reopen a special formal session so they can take roll call votes and pass these billions of dollars in bond authorizations. It's really rare that they do this. The last time they did it was in 2020 around the COVID pandemic, which, clearly disrupted the legislative calendar. They have the July 31st deadline for what they think is a good reason, but they've both shown willingness to break the normal procedures and come back to pass at least this bill. And then there are questions, the advocates who fought for the climate bill, for the hospital bill, saying, well, if you're opening up for formal sessions for the economic development bond bill, why can't you start passing this other stuff that was gridlocked too? So there is a path forward here for all 10 of these bills that didn't pass.
And how can these lawmakers be held accountable?
It's a very good question. A lot of people point to the fact that there are very few electoral or political consequences for this type of governing, for this type of inaction. An analysis by the Commonwealth Beacon shows that 65% of incumbents don't even have a challenger in this election cycle. It's very, very rare that incumbents lose their seats. If you don't get voted out of office because your constituents are mad at you for not, passing certain priorities. I was speaking to Gerald Duquette. He's a professor at Central Connecticut State University who studies New England politics. He says it's a powerful absence of incentive.
The question is, what is worth doing about it?
So what he's saying there is that if there's not a challenger or a threat waiting in the wings, why change the status quo? Why change what's working for you?
From here, where do we go? What should we be looking out for?
We will be watching to see whether they actually call this special formal session, and then we will see if they're going to pass not just the economic development bond bill, but if some of this other stuff can come back to life as well.
Understood. Walt, thank you so much for your reporting on this, staying up all night, watching it closely. We appreciate you. And of course, thank you for coming through to The Common.
Thank you.
Next up, The Common takes a hike, literally. We'll be right back.
Support for this podcast comes from MathWorks, creator of MATLAB and Simulink software. The aerospace company Kinetics uses MATLAB to develop optical navigation for spacecrafts.
What's interesting about optical navigation is once you have the camera, which is the metaphorical eye here on the spacecraft, then you have to break down all the math that we human beings take for granted that comes with seeing.
Stick around until the end of this episode for a special segment on how to navigate a spacecraft to Pluto.
Politics has never been stranger or more online, which is why the politics team at Wired is making a new show, Wired Politics Lab. It's all about how to navigate the endless stream of news and information and what to look out for. Each week on the show, we'll dig into far-right platforms, AI chatbots, influencer campaigns, and so much more. Wired Politics Lab launches Thursday, April 11th. Follow the show wherever you get your podcasts.
And we're back with a question from journalist/urban trail builder Miles Howard.
Have you two heard of the Wizard of Franklin Park before?
No.
Cannot say I have.
This is another oddity that is kind of close to the trail route. It's located deep in the woods up there. It would probably require a bit of a bushwhack at the moment, so I'm not sure if today's the best condition for seeing it, but it's a hollowed-out tree trunk in which somebody, some years ago, painted a rendition of a Gandalf-like wizard, basically lurking in the tree right there.
The Wizard of Franklin Park.
That's right.
Damn, if only we could bushwhack.
Unfortunately, this is not a story about the Wizard of Franklin Park, but it is about one of the avenues through which you could go visit him for yourself. The Boston Walking City Trail, a continuous walking route established in 2022 that connects 27 miles of Boston's immersive green spaces. Earlier this summer, we had the pleasure of hiking a portion of the trail with Miles, who is actually its founder. The trees in Franklin Park are dense and green this time of year, and they block out a lot of the city's noise. It's almost like you'd never know you were in the heart of Boston. If I were a wizard, I'd post up there in a tree too. Along the way, we talked about how the trail came to be, the value of urban hiking, as well as some of the history behind certain sites along the Walking City Trail, beginning with our starting point at the Southwest Corridor Park in Jamaica Plain.
Where are we along the trail?
So we are currently roughly halfway along Section 2 of the Walking City Trail. It's divided into 4 sections that range from about 5 to 8 miles each, all connected to various public transit stops. And each section has kind of a theme. The theme of Section 2 is the big, epic, sculpted parks of Boston. And we're standing on the Southwest Corridor Park, which runs from Forest Hill Station to Back Bay. And, the whole thing is the result of community activism and organizing that stopped I-95 from being built through Boston back in the urban renewal era.
Right.
This park was one of the alternative activations that was applied to the space where the highway was supposed to go, as well as the section of the Orange Line that connects to Forest Hills down here, too.
Now, the Boston Walking City Trail connects dozens of already established walking paths throughout the city. So sometimes you need to walk a couple blocks in between to get from one to the other. So if you hear cars, that's why. As we walked one of these stretches through JP's residential area, I asked Miles about the inspiration behind the trail.
The idea that you could make a trail in the city like this by stitching together green spaces via one walking route really hit me in late 2021 when I read a story in National Geographic about a trail just like this in San Francisco called the Crosstown Trail, a 17-mile route across some of the city's lesser-known forests and canyons that was all put together in a couple of years, mostly by grassroots volunteers who just knew these areas well, went out, walked them, and mapped this one hiking route through it all. I thought that was the coolest idea, and the thing that was so intriguing about it was creating that trail didn't require tons of capital or, a background in physical trail construction. It was a curation, basically. So long story short, I went out, hiked it, had a great time, and on the plane ride back home, I was looking at maps of Boston and imagining what a similar trail here could feature, where it could go. So that's how it all got started in 2022.
Wow. So you were inspired by San Francisco?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, and because Boston already has a lot of historic walking trails, like the Freedom Trail and the Black Heritage Trail and the Women's Heritage Trails, there is some precedent, of course, for trail making in Boston. Trail making that is essentially, again, like a curation of pre-existing walkable spaces into one thematic and intentional route. And, that is one of the key things that I think is worth asking whenever you're trying to design a trail in a city, which is, what is the theme of this trail? What is it about? Because if it was simply visiting all the green spaces in Boston, then the Walking City Trail could easily have been over 100 miles. And so I decided that the theme of this route would be the most immersive green spaces in Boston, environments that make you feel like you've entered this little leafy nebula within the cityscape, basically.
And Boston has plenty of those.
Yeah, we actually have, there's a pretty impressive metric now that, thanks to some of the creation of new parks and green spaces and playgrounds in recent decades, every resident of Boston now lives within a 10 to 15 minute walk of a green space at this point. So it's an ideal venue for doing something like this.
At this point, we made it to the Franklin Park entrance at Forest Hills and William Streets, where we entered the immersive green space portion of our hike and got a little geology lesson from Miles.
So this is the part of the trail that gets to be more like a trail, right?
Exactly. This is kind of more what people are going to imagine when they hear hiking. And, I think because the idea of urban hiking is still kind of an emerging thing these days, I thought, one thing that would be nice about doing a trail, built around immersive green spaces was that in some ways it would cater to people's idea of what they expect from a hike ultimately, but it would also challenge them to see the beauty in less pristine environments too.
There we go.
We're seeing all these little boulders around the entrance right here, which are very bumpy and porridgey looking, and these are big chunks of Roxbury puddingstone, which is a natural conglomerate type rock that's actually the official state rock of Massachusetts. And we're going to see a lot more of that within the park. And even walking around neighborhoods here, you'll see people whose walls are made of this stuff too. So it's a nice little Easter egg for the area.
Roxbury puddingstone.
Yeah.
One of the really nice things about the Walking City Trail is how accessible it is, even without a car or prior hiking experience. We wanted to know if Miles is seeing that accessibility translate into more diversity within Boston's green spaces.
What I'm finding really interesting about this is that the Boston Walking City Trail is very accessible, public transportation, right in people's neighborhoods and their backyards, essentially. Do you see this as a way to get more diversity in things like hiking?
I think that's totally part of the ideal outcome of trail designs like this. I mean, one of the things that I love about the Emerald Necklace, as soon as I learned about what it was the realization that it was this kind of singular artery of connected green spaces that, also connected many neighborhoods in Boston too. Like this long green corridor that was essentially a common good. And, I think in the best case scenario, something like that inspires a sense of collective ownership and access to green spaces that cut across a pretty diverse swath of residential areas here and there. And that's very much what we try to promote with the Walking City Trail too. The idea that, all of these spaces, not just the parks, but the neighborhoods themselves are much closer often, in terms of connections than we think of them. And that walking can be a way of savoring them and, discovering these connections, and also offering free community events that get people out onto them so they can see, what's hidden in these parks and how close some of these spaces actually are. I think that you do build toward a point where you have a greater diversity of use and activation of these spaces too.
Are you seeing this trail bringing out more people who may not have been into the outdoors before?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I was really curious about when we did our first urban hike on the trail, though the first one that I hosted, which was in the summer of 2022, I was kind of wondering, who's going to show up to this? And actually, what was really cool to see is that on most of those early urban hikes, we had folks who really weren't that experienced with hiking, who were people who didn't necessarily think of themselves as hikers from the beginning. It was more it was a sense of intrigue about the concept and the places we were going to walk through that got them out there. And I think that was the doorway for people. And one thing that was nice too was a lot of these folks, some of whom may have been getting their first taste of hiking in that sense, where you put on a backpack and commit to going out for a few hours. They came back for the subsequent urban hikes afterward too, because these hikes basically covered each section of the whole trail. So So that was great to see. And, in general, when promoting the trail and talking about all the things you can do on the Walking City Trail, I really try to emphasize the elements that don't kind of come with the intimidation factor of traditional hiking activities. I talk about the amenities you can avail yourself of off the trail, like the restaurants and such. I talk about, how the trail does include some challenging hilly sections, but also sections that are perfect for strolling or, what people might think of as forest bathing in some parks that are a bit more laid back. And
forest bathing?
Yeah.
Explain that.
That is one of these terms for something that many of us have been doing for a long time. I've only started using it recently, but it's the idea of basically taking a meditative stroll through a place just like this, actually, where we're surrounded by greenery, a forest, ideally. It could be backcountry, could be urban, and just kind of becoming one with the environment for a little bit, letting your mind wander, picking a walking route that's going to be free of things like trip hazards that could distract you, and just having kind of a meditative experience, blissing out for a bit.
So yeah, the Walking City Trail is an awesome place to become one with nature and appreciate Boston's natural beauty. But it also takes you past some of the fascinating pieces of man-made history you can find tucked away in Boston's parks.
All right, now where are we now? Oh, Are these the bear cages?
That's right. Yeah, we are at the entrance to the old Franklin Park bear cages, which were part of a older incarnation of the Franklin Park Zoo back in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. People would come here to gawk at these bears that were held in pretty austere conditions within these cages. You've got these tight circular cages that still have rusting bars, which we can see, and they're now kind of overwhelmed with plants and greenery. And along the whole enclosure, you can see these old rusting spikes that were put there to keep the bears from climbing out if they ever managed to, get all the way up there. But now you can just kind of freely roam throughout them, and the whole thing kind of reminds me of the show Lost in some ways. When I amble through here, just, this is the most remote northern corner of the park, and these things are still looming.
What happened to the bears?
I think most of them died, but I prefer to believe that they escaped and are still living secretly in the alleyways and pocket parks of Boston these days.
Me too.
Yeah.
Me too.
Yeah.
At this point, we were nearing the end of our 2-mile jaunt on the Boston Walking City Trail. But don't worry, we won't leave you without some tips from Miles on how to get started hiking in the city.
So let me ask you this, Miles. Let's say somebody's listening and they're not much of an outdoorsy person. What would you tell them to get them started?
The first thing I recommend doing is going to the official website for the trail, bostontrails.org, and looking at the maps and directions for the whole thing so that you can get kind of a visual sense of what the route looks like, what's located along each section, and what the public transit connections are for each trail segment. And that's all on there, pretty easy to run through. And from there, I recommend taking a little jaunt in the field. If you haven't really hiked before and you're a little unsure of whether this is for you, maybe, start with kind of a modest goal of, a couple of miles or so, maybe even less than that. Maybe, you could try a piece of the trail that runs close to territory in Boston that you're familiar with too. Maybe even your neighborhood, for instance. Mm-hmm. But, whichever way you plan to go about it, what I recommend packing are at least a liter of water, especially in the summer. You probably want 2 liters at that point, although there are plenty of places you can fill up near the trail too. Clothing that is going to make it somewhat comfortable for you to be outside for at least a couple of hours in whatever the conditions are that day. So if it's a hot day, that probably means, something that, is loose and breathable, a broad-brimmed hat for sun protection, and of course, plenty of sunblock. If it's rainy, a rain jacket is always welcome, but also on an urban hike, you can hike with an umbrella quite easily too. I would rope a friend or two into it as well, bring a few accomplices. That can really, enhance the experience of discovering this stuff that you didn't realize exists right within the cityscape, is, having that experience collectively. And I think especially for, territory on the trail that might be less familiar to you or intimidating in ways, there's strength in numbers when it comes to hiking in any environment, whether it is rural or urban. But the nice thing about being on a trail like the Walking City Trail is that if you do get into a rough patch, you can always give a holler and someone will be nearby in most cases.
And that's all for this week. Have you tried the Boston Walking City Trail? Send us a photo from your hike or tell us about your favorite place to walk in Boston. You can reach out to us on Instagram at WBURTheCommon, or you can send us an email at thecommon@wbur.org. And now it is that time for me to let you know that The Common is produced by Franny Monahan. It's mixed by Emily Jankowski and Paul Vaitkus, and it's edited by Samatha Joshi and Ben Brock Johnson. And our theme music is Me by Hisu. I'm Daryl C. Murphy, and we'll be back next Thursday with another new episode of The Common. Talk to you then.
Support for this podcast comes from MathWorks, accelerating the pace of engineering and science. Listen on for a story of how one company is using MathWorks software to help spacecrafts navigate through the solar system.
How was New Horizons, a spacecraft about the size of a grand piano, able to fly more than 3 billion miles to navigate to and fly past Pluto, capturing spectacular images of the dwarf planet along the way? Well, it starts with curiosity.
What are our beginnings? Where did we come from, essentially, and how did our solar system develop?
That's Derek Nelson, an engineer for Kinetics, an aerospace company responsible for the navigation system aboard that mission and many others. He says once we start asking the right questions, the next step is making sure we have the right technology to start answering them.
So historically, even interplanetary missions used radio tracking.
He says radio tracking is essentially
using antennas on Earth to send radio signals to the spacecraft and receive those signals back.
Radio signals from Earth are determining where a spacecraft is relative to Earth, which is really neat when you think about it. This technology has taken spacecrafts to Mars and beyond. But to go to Pluto, radio tracking wasn't enough.
For certain planets that you've never been to or that are far away, like Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto, you need to know where the spacecraft is relative to that planet. And we, as the science community, at the time didn't know exactly where those planets were.
Enter optical navigation.
What Kinetics is sort of unique with is that we also incorporate optical navigation data. And what that means is using the cameras on board a spacecraft to take images of the target that ultimately you're trying to navigate to.
So essentially, spacecrafts are given a brand new tool to navigate, their own eyes.
And so, for example, we did this with the Pluto flyby of the New Horizons mission. And so the way that we do that is we take images of the target, so in this case, Pluto, with respect to background stars in the same image. So those stars in the image give us the orientation of the camera, and then we find the center of Pluto in each of the images, and that gives us the position of the spacecraft relative to Pluto, and that's what we use to navigate.
One of the benefits of optical navigation is how precise it can be, which can be useful for all sorts of missions.
So for example, the OSIRIS-REx mission to asteroid Bennu required navigation on the order of centimeters around the asteroid. And so you can think of it as in trying to navigate a spacecraft that's behind the sun, essentially, down to centimeter precision.
So the technology is very precise, but it's complicated and takes more than just advanced sensors.
Now, what's interesting about optical navigation is once you have the camera, which is the metaphorical eye here on the spacecraft, then you have to break down all the math that we human beings take for granted that comes with seeing.
That's Ossie Sorella, the space segment manager at MathWorks, the creator of MATLAB, which is the software core to Kinetics' optical navigation platform.
When we see an object, we can kind of intuitively tell where it's positioned, whether it's moving, and what we're looking at. We've learned that over the years. A spacecraft doesn't inherently know that, so you have to break down all of those things into math and translate it into an algorithmic form that a computer can solve.
He says technology brings us one step closer to a world where autonomous navigation is ubiquitous on spacecrafts.
Historically, human operators would do a lot of commanding to direct the spacecraft. Picture an army of people in the mission control room. That's kind of what we think about. But now we're getting to the point where we want spacecrafts to do these activities by themselves.
Either way, we've reached a new frontier in the world of space navigation, which could be valuable beyond just the scientific discoveries. Derek Nelson again.
So for me personally, I value the scientific developments and discoveries that we're gaining on all of these NASA missions and commercial missions. But I also really enjoy the human element, the human exploration of space exploration in particular. And so what that means is it's a subtle distinction, but I really like to go explore new places. The scientific discoveries are incredible, but for me, it's really the exploring new spaces and new frontiers that really excites me.
To learn more about MathWorks and kinetics, and for more stories, check out wbur.org/mathworks.